All right. Well, welcome everybody to the first night of the MSU Science Festival. We're kicking off 30 days of science, technology, engineering, arts, and math fun. My name is Roxanne Truan. I'm the coordinator of the Michigan State University Science Festival. And tonight I'm joined by Dr. Duke Elsner, the president of the Michigan Entomological Society and a retired MSU Extension person up in the Grand Traverse County area. So welcome, Dr. Elsner. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
First of all, thank you for running the MSU Science Festival, even under these rugged times. So it's good that we can still do this stuff. And I look forward to doing it live someday and in person, let's put it that way. I'm an retired extension educator that worked in the Traverse City area for almost close to 30 years. And I worked a great deal with the wine industry up here and the fruit industry. But my long time background, ever since I was a kid, was being an entomologist, a guy who loved bugs all the way through. And I've got 3 degrees all the way up to the doctoral level in entomology. So I know way too much about it. But I am still really an avid hobbyist in some ways when it comes to butterflies and moths. It never really was exactly my line of work, but I've always dealt with them. And so I've got lots and lots of photographs and a lot of experience in the field, in the wild, and in raising some of these things in the lab.
Awesome. Do you have a favorite before we get started?
Yeah, I don't think it appears in the show. I can't recall if I included it or not. It's a little creature called the Earlyhairstreak butterfly. And it's, I bet it, you know, I haven't looked at the slides in a while. I think it's in the end of this. Okay. If it isn't, and there's time, I'll show pictures of it.
Okay. And if you have any questions, our audience members out there, you can type them in the Q&A section of the webinar. And if you're listening live on Facebook, you can put your questions in the comment section on Facebook too. So we'll get started.
Okay. We'll go to the share screen button and see if it works like it did during the practice session. It appears to be on my screen the right way.
It looks great.
Okay. So the topic tonight, Michigan's butterflies and their habitat needs. We'll discuss a little bit about where you typically find them and also try to talk about some of the things that favor them or disfavor them. Things that happen due to land development and just sometimes just natural habitat change. Areas progress and plants grow and things change over time. I'm currently president of the Michigan Entomological Society. It's a fun group. It's not very technical. Anybody can be in that organization. And so if you have friends, family, young people, we're always looking for young people interested in the Michigan Entomological Society. Just contact me because I think my contact information is at the end of this. And if it isn't, we'll get it to you somehow. So we're going to introduce you to Michigan's major butterfly groups. There's about 170 of them, so we can't cover every bit of them. Talk a bit about the diverse habitats of Michigan, which allows us to have such a rich fauna of butterflies and actually moths too, tremendous amount of moths in Michigan. A little bit about the terminology for distributions and populations so that you might be more able to understand reports or news articles that you hear about butterflies. And some selected examples of Michigan's butterflies and a few comments on good references and resources. I think that almost every photograph in this presentation was taken by me. If I run across one that I didn't, I'll try to make sure that I give credit to others. Well, here's a photo I didn't take, for instance. This is off of Google Earth. But Michigan has about 110 butterflies, give or take a few. And then there's 50 creatures in a group called skippers. And that also is maybe a couple more species. New ones have been reported in recent years. Skippers are grouped with butterflies most of the time. They have a lot of butterfly-like character. In some ways, they're a little bit more like moths. But most of us that deal in butterflies deal in both of them. Comparatively, there are thousands, probably way over 1,000 moth species in Michigan. Moths are much more diverse in habitats and size and food plants. It's a really huge field to study the moths. Even just studying the big ones is difficult, and then they get on down to the tiny ones known as microlepidopterans. Only people who are a little bit odd can work with those things as far as I can tell. So the major families of butterflies in Michigan are currently, things do change around once in a while in taxonomy, but right now we have swallowtail butterflies, and the technical name for them, Papilionidae. There's a group called whites and sulfurs that are typically shades of white and or yellow. That's their primary shades, so that's the reason for that common name of that group. The coppers, hairstreaks, elfins, blues are a very diverse bunch of creatures, but they're all really small, and their larvae are all very similar. We'll see the adults don't look anything like each other sometimes. Fancy term for their family is Lysinidae. Metal marks, of which there is only one species in Michigan, pretty hard to find. And then the giant family, which kind of catches a whole bunch of them, is called brushfoots, and it includes everything from monarchs on through to things that are called wood nymphs and arctics. So again, a big range of shape and size and form within that group. It used to be split up into several more families, but times have changed on the opinion of that. And then skippers, which have their own family. The swallowtails are the biggest butterflies in Michigan. A really large one could be close to 5 inches across sometimes, maybe even a little bit more, depending on how they hold their wings. They're all very showy, and when they're fresh and whole anyway, they have really prominent tails on their hind wings. The tails do break off quite easily. It's really common to see swallowtails missing those parts. And they actually serve a purpose of defense against predation by birds. It confuses the birds as to which end is forward on the butterfly. So the birds will often strike at the tails on the wings because they're even more showy than the true antennae, thinking that they're hitting the head end of the butterfly. They get a mouthful of wing, but the butterfly gets away. And it's very common amongst butterflies that have tails, that they typically make it confusing to birds as to which end is forward. There's 7 species of swallowtails, widely distributed. We'll talk about a couple individual ones later. The whites and sulfurs, Pieridae, these are mostly small to mid-sized butterflies. 1.5 inches across would be about as big as they'll ever see. Quite variable though, in terms of markings. We have 9 species in Michigan, but there are several more southern species in this family that occasionally show up in Michigan. They don't establish and stay here and reproduce here, but they fly in from the south, and you can see them from time to time. It's an interesting group because some of the ones that are yellow, like the upper left here, those 3, are all the same species. There are albino females, the fairly good number of them in the population of some of these. So that can be challenging when you don't have the original color that you expect when you're trying to identify one of these. This is a quick look at the Lysinidae, the coppers and hairstreaks, elfins and blues. This is my favorite group of butterflies overall, and that one I mentioned earlier, or one I was thinking about earlier, the Earlyhairstreak, is in this family. All small, very delicate creatures, a few of them with tails on the hind wings, 34 species, but the average person, unless they're really out there looking in the right habitats, will see about 6. So this is a cryptic bunch, hard to locate. This is the one metal mark in Michigan, aptly named. The scales on the wings have those striking patterns of metal-like markings. I mean, there are just shiny scales that iridesce a bit, and it looks very silvery. Beautiful butterfly, found only in a few places and a very rare sight to see. I've only seen it once. The brushfoots, the Nymphalidae, it's a huge family, as I mentioned earlier. The reason they're called brushfoots is all butterflies have 6 legs on adults, like we'd expect out of insects. The brushfoots stand on only 4 of the legs, and the front two legs are very small and reduced in size, and they only use them to clean their face and antennae. So that's why they're called brushfoots. Other than that, the variability within the family is tremendous. 50 species in Michigan, some of them extremely hard to tell apart from each other, even by professionals. And then that skipper group, which is pretty large too, 50 species, they're usually drably colored, although you get some intense oranges sometimes and a few good shades of yellow, but nothing like other butterflies. They're delicate in appearance, but they are the fastest, toughest butterflies to deal with. They're super strong. If you try to hold one, you can just feel the muscles vibrate inside that butterfly getting ready to take off from you. Very hard to photograph because they're super fast. So all of these different families thrive in particular circumstances, or at least some members of the families thrive under some circumstances, and you'll find them there and you won't find them anywhere else. It's really cued to plant mixtures, moisture, exposure, sun, shade, things like that, sandy soils versus wet soils. So all the different natural habitats of Michigan, of which there are quite a few, but these are the principal ones, have their own characteristic groupings of butterflies and moths that you might find there. The oak hickory forest is very widespread in the state, but so is beech maple, birch, hemlock forest, and the rest of them are a little bit harder to come by, although there's plenty of them. We don't see them as often. They're a little more out of the way. Some of the swamps, for instance, you have to drive quite a ways off a paved road to get to some of the really best swamps in Michigan, if there is such a thing as a best swamp. Some of them are adventuresome places to go. Tamarack and poison sumac fens, that doesn't sound good, but there's some really wonderful butterflies in there if you're willing to put up with the hazards. Acid bogs have their own unique set of creatures. Dry tall grass prairies, which there used to be a lot more of in Michigan and southern Michigan. Now it's a lot of, these are remnant sites, have their own share of interesting butterflies. And then what we're really just loaded with, of course, is coastal sand dunes and coastal climates. And there are some very special butterflies that live in those areas. The reason Michigan is such a diverse pile of life forms and land forms is all the glacial activity that occurred. This is just a listing of the kinds of deposits that there are in the state. And I have friends of mine that are lepidopterists studying butterflies in the Upper Peninsula that actually look for them by studying the soil maps first. And they pick out the sites based on soil types and geological formations. And then they target those areas looking for unique specimens or particular species. And they're remarkably good at it. So it's the land that determines the life, and land and water that determines the life. And Michigan is a fabulous place because of all the variety that we have. So some of the examples of these things, southern lower peninsula has a lot of more lush, damper, wetter zones, a little bit more rainfall in the north, a little bit heavier soils. You can run into a little dirt road like this that you can hardly get through because of the mud. But these are just heavenly places to go looking for butterflies. And the number of different butterflies that are going to live here are just remarkable because the variety of plant life is so diverse. Right near the wettest areas, you're going to have the wetland plants on down to bog plants, and then it goes drier and drier as you go away from into the hill country. This is just 30, 40 species a day should be no problem to be seen in a place like this as long as you're far enough south in the state. There's a lot of wonderful mid and northern Michigan that is sandy and dry, a little bit windy, but a whole different group of creatures here. There are some, of course, that will cross over, but to be expected, there's a lot of different life here, a lot of different butterflies. Things that have grown into blooming woody shrubs will be very different than open grassy areas. If you find one of the things that entomologists kind of like, as lepidopterous folks, we don't really appreciate, let's put it this way, a clear cut in a forest is not a wonderful thing by any means. We know it happens for various forestry reasons and other reasons. But what follows, the regrowth, is always really interesting country. And for the next 10 to 15 years before the bigger trees start really showing up, the diversity of butterfly life in these areas is outstanding. And here's a northern lower peninsula dry grass prairie in bloom. It's a lot more than grasses, a great deal of hawkweeds and many other things. And this is just a very productive place to look for all kinds of insects, but butterflies, just wonderful. Now, the shadier areas of the state, where the forest is fairly dense, has very few butterflies. Butterflies prefer sites where they can get open sun and plenty of it. So 20 yards away from this, in an opening, there could be lots of butterfly life. On this particular path that goes deep through the woods, you might see 3 or 4 species in the whole year. So they're very sensitive to this. They may live here as caterpillars. In fact, my favorite one feeds on these beech trees as a caterpillar, but you'll hardly ever see that butterfly actually in the woods. The adults will fly out in the open spaces where there are nectar plants and sunshine and more warmth to sun in. So that's how that goes. So here's a few of the things that you'll see in references and books and stuff if you pick up any textbook or not textbook, like field guide for say, on butterflies and other insects. One of the most common terms you'll read is widespread. That means it's found in many habitats over a pretty broad geographic range, like probably at least all of half of a peninsula of Michigan, if not the whole peninsula, one or the other. It doesn't necessarily say that it's numerous or easy to find. It's just a physical distribution kind of thing. Scattered is a term we use when they're out there in more specific habitats, but still over a broad range. There might be a little pocket of them in the UP, some over in the Alpena area, things like that. But a lot of different places, maybe not nearly as contiguous of a range as a widespread would indicate. A local species is one that's restricted to less common habitats. So very unique bog setting or something like that, they might be very numerous in the right place, but you have to know their locale or their local areas in order to find one. And a rare species is restricted to less common habitats typically, not always, and is usually present in low numbers. Although rare gets kind of confused with a different thing, which is rarely observed or rarely encountered, which could mean that people just aren't looking for them in the right place, or they don't have a habit of coming to where people are to easily be seen. There are some butterflies like that in Michigan. We'll try to point them out. Some population terminology then. If we say it's abundant, that doesn't mean there's thousands of them out there. It probably is, but it doesn't necessarily, because no one has really made counts of the populations of most butterflies. It's a very wide open world for research, if anybody was interested in working on it. Except for monarchs, almost no species is counted to any degree. But if we call it abundant, it probably means you can easily see hundreds a year if you put yourself in the right place. Common, somewhere between, you're bound to see it, maybe not a bundle of them in any given year. Uncommon, you're not likely to run into it unless you're in a very favorable habitat. And then rare is unlikely to be seen even in the best habitat because there's usually not very many of them. All this gets combined. You can have widespread and abundant species, which would be like monarchs, but that also includes those little yellow sulfur butterflies. They're just everywhere. Cabbage butterfly is one of the pest species found throughout the state every year, everywhere. You can be widespread and common, just not quite the highest numbers. Local and common, usually written as locally common. There are many of them that are local to specific habitats, but also uncommon. That usually means that the food plant is not very numerous, even when you're in the right place. And then the rare or rarely encountered. So all of this stuff shows up as you read about butterflies. So the way I was going to go through this was starting with these different kind of categories, these grouped categories. Widespread and abundant species. These maps of the state that I'm showing, if the county is colored in green, that means the species has been seen in that county and recorded from that county. And for this particular map happens to be for the monarch. And you'll see right away, there's problems with the data. The monarch is almost certainly present in all 83 counties of Michigan. But unless it's officially documented by somebody and reported through the channels, it doesn't end up in the distribution maps. I am the person currently maintaining distribution maps for the state of Michigan. And unless somebody sends me a note from GoGeobic that there's a monarch there and verify, you know, somebody I know can identify it or send me a photo, I can't green in the little county until I get that. So maybe someday I'll go there and record it. But even places like Ionia and Shiawassee downstate where there's so many people, it just hasn't been officially reported. Now you'd think that we could just green in the whole map, but we do not do that, because when people see these maps, they go, oh, I'm sure it's there. This encourages citizen science activity for somebody to go out and prove to us that Ascota County has got this, or Sanilac has got this particular thing. And then we build our data sets even bigger. So it's done on purpose to not put the painted brush across the whole state, but to list it exactly the way the data holds. So other widespread and abundant species are the clouded sulfur and the cabbage white, also known as cabbage butterfly. So here's our monarch. Got to include him in any talk, because it's such a pivotal insect in today's world. We're so concerned over the monarch because its population has really crashed significantly since just the 1990s. It was still doing very well. It has a remarkable life history. All the butterflies, adult butterflies of the monarch in the fall of the year in Michigan and the whole eastern United States migrate to Mexico and live in a very small area, millions to a tree kind of thing. And then in the springtime, adults restart the return trip, but only go part way. They lay a generation or lay eggs, and the next generation continues the trip northward. And it's usually the second or third generation later before they come back to Michigan. All the caterpillars eat nothing but milkweeds. It's about a dozen species in the eastern United States, but they prefer common milkweed and butterfly milkweed. Swamp milkweed is a very good host as well. The clouded sulfur is probably the second most abundant butterfly in the state, maybe more so now that the monarch's numbers have gone down. They are found almost everywhere. Again, we don't have records from certain places. It's a beautiful little butterfly for how common and small it is. It gets overlooked, really. People see a cloud of them fly up along a dirt road when they drive. They don't stop to pay attention to how really cool they are. They got little pink edges on their wings. They have beautiful spots, and they're easy to get up close to. This is the cabbage butterfly. Caterpillars feed on anything in the cabbage family, so almost all the cole crops, and it can be a really significant pest in the home gardens and in agricultural production. It is certainly throughout the whole state too, and we're just missing a few county records. Every year I try to head out and pick up a few of those just to make sure, if I know I'm going someplace, I've got my little wish list with me of what hasn't been seen in a particular county, so that I can try to go find out if it really is there.
Can I stop you for a minute? We have quite a few questions that have
this would be a great point to do that.
One person wants to know what is the rarest butterfly, and I'm guessing in Michigan.
Oh, wow. There's a couple of skippers right now that are very hard to find. They're on the endangered species list. They're used to be more common down in Washtenaw, Wayne, and Monroe counties. Oddly enough, one of them is named the Duke skipper, but it has nothing to do with me. I've never seen that specimen or that species. I would love to see it before it's gone. It's probably land use changes and habitat loss that's running that one out. The some of the ones that are also on the endangered list, like MitchellSeder butterfly, which I will show later, it's just only got 4 colonies that we know of in the whole state. So even if nothing is developed in their areas, there's always the risk of some natural disaster like a brush fire or something. It could take out a whole colony at any time. That one's pretty rare in the state.
Christina has a question of why butterflies like the sun, and then a follow-up by Jamie is there any protection from freezing within butterflies? Is that perhaps why they like the sun?
Sure. They are sun-loving creatures. There's no real reason why they would have to be. They're very close relatives to moths, which fly at night, certainly carry out their lives without having warm sun to bask in or to heat them up. But the butterflies as a whole are just love to be active in the sunshine. And if you're out looking for them, all it takes is a passing cloud to change how active they are. You just suddenly can't find them, as adults anyway. So really super sensitive to it. I can't give you a fabulous reason for it. All of these species that we've talked about and will talk about, except for the monarch, are able to withstand freezing temperatures in Michigan in some stage of their lives. In most of them, it's not the adult, but they are designed to get through Michigan's winters. The monarch is the only one that can't do it, and it's the one that leaves the state.
And is there any butterfly that is only found in Michigan?
Not that I know of. Even the Karner Blue, which is considered to be pretty special to Michigan, I believe there are populations of that in Wisconsin. So it's a good question. I should work on that one.
All right, I think that gets us through most of the questions right now. Please ask your questions in the Q&A if you're on the Zoom webinar, and in the comments if you're on Facebook Live.
Okay. So on to widespread and fairly common species, but not quite as abundant. American painted lady, which I'll show you, is one of those. It's throughout the state. You don't see it in numbers, but you'll run into it everywhere. Eastern tiger swallowtail and Canadian tiger swallowtail are like that, but there are many, many more that we will not entirely cover. Here's American painted lady. Caterpillars feed on pearly everlasting and pussy toes, which are not that common when you get right down to it. But they also feed on a weed called burdock. Burdock is all over the place in agricultural fields and gardens and things as a pest plant to us. It's probably what really maintains the largest part of the population of this particular butterfly. It's a beautiful creature. It overwinters as an adult, as a dormant adult. So you'll start seeing this one moving around throughout the state in generally somewhere in April if you get a really good warm spell, but usually early May. It just hasn't been hunted for in some places. That's the reasons for those open spots on the maps. Beautiful butterfly with wonderful eye spots on the bottom. When you get to see one in person up close, you'll just really appreciate it a lot. The Eastern tiger swallowtail, widespread, common, but only in the southern half of the lower peninsula. It really has a line kind of that it doesn't cross much. Even with the changing in climates and relatively warmer temperatures, it has not moved north. Even though the food plant is certainly out there, there's wild cherries, ash, and especially wild cherry and ash all the way through into the upper peninsula. Tulip poplar is not very common as you go north, so it might be mainly the range of tulip poplar that's limiting this. It's an interesting butterfly. In the color photo there on the left of the two butterflies, the black and yellow one, which is, I guess mainly we should say yellow with black, is the male. And most of the females are just like that, but there is a portion of the population of females only that is deep black with the blue. And they are primarily more in the southern part of the range, and on in this. It's found throughout the United States in the south as well. Michigan's the northern limit of it, really. So if you go farther south, you run into a lot more of those dark-colored females. The caterpillar is a cute little thing. It looks like a little frog or a little snake to kind of fools predators. These spots here at the front end of it are just fake. They're not real eyes, but it gives the impression of being kind of like a little frog or a little snake sitting on a leaf. The Canadian tiger swallowtail is kind of where this thing picks up as we go north. It's not found in the southern counties. One record from Genesee. It's slightly different in appearance. If I see a picture of them, especially if I see an underside, I can tell them apart. Otherwise, they're very similar, but it will not eat tulip tree. It eats wild cherries like the other one, and trembling or quaking aspen is the typical food plant for it. So very similar. It does not have any of the dark colored females in its population. It's always yellow with black. Some of the locally common ones, where if you're in the right place at the right time, you see them very frequently, but certainly far less widely distributed. West Virginia white and mustard white are the two that I'll actually cover the Karner a little bit as well. We'll show you the difference between the two whites, because they're very similar in appearance, but you can almost be assured that if you're in a certain habitat, you're seeing a West Virginia white and not a mustard white, and vice versa. The West Virginia white caterpillars feed on toothwort, which is not very common, but it's in the higher rolling sand beech maple forests in the northern part of the state. And that's typically where you're going to find the butterfly as well. Very plain white. The early spring ones have more markings on the underside. And the mustard white is really hard to tell apart from it if you just have a specimen or even a photo in front of you. But it feeds on wild mustards in wetland settings. So it's a little bit more widespread because the wetlands are certainly very widespread. But you will hardly ever find these two butterflies next to each other. They just don't leave their particular favorite habitats. If they're 100 yards apart, they'll probably stay 100 yards apart because the mustard whites won't leave the wetlands and the West Virginia whites won't leave the hilly dry countries. Then Karner Blue, one of our endangered species, is doing very well in places where its habitat has been protected. If you ever get a chance to take a field trip to see Karner Blue, and they're organized sometimes by conservation districts and the United States Natural Resource Service, it's actually relatively easy to run into a Karner Blue if you're there on the right day. So it's a success story. It was fading out pretty badly, but by proper management of habitat, it is now doing very well in the state of Michigan. So some locally uncommon creatures where you got to be in the right place and still you got to be lucky. It's zebra swallowtails, beautiful beast. And then a couple of hairstreaks, I'll talk about just one of them. And Harris Checkerspot is a very beautiful little butterfly. Zebra swallowtail is fascinating insect. It's the fastest flying swallowtail we have. I have never been able to keep up with one. You have to wait for them to come to flowers if you want to get a good photo or a specimen, as I do from time to time. It's got very long tails, and it feeds only on pawpaw, no other plants. And pawpaws only grow in pretty wet lowland soils, mainly along larger rivers in Michigan. The prime place to look for this one is along the St. Joseph River in Southwest Michigan. Most of the other green marked counties have not had a record for this specimen in 30 or 40 years, or for this species. So we don't know if it's still there in some of these other places because the habitats have changed or have been converted to other uses. But a gorgeous thing. This is the Acadian Hairstreak, one of like 15 or so different hairstreaks that we have. They're all pretty similar to this in appearance. It feeds on willows, which is much more common than pawpaw in wetland settings. But personally, I've only seen this one a few times in the far south part of the state. The records from the north don't come in nearly as often, so it may have some temperature range involved in it as well. And the little tiny hairs on the end of that tail, again, fool birds and other predators into thinking the butterfly's facing the other way around. This is Harris's Checkerspot. It feeds on asters, but only one aster out of all the asters in Michigan. It feeds on flat top white aster as a caterpillar. But luckily, that is fairly widely distributed plant. If you're in the right place, once in a while, you'll run into this one. And the last time I saw it, I saw dozens of it in a few hours. So, but you know, it was a few years prior the last time I saw it as well. You just don't get a chance on some of these very often. Rarely encountered species. Yeah, I did. Yep, Earlyhairstreak is in here. So we'll start with that swamp meadowlark. It's known from several southern counties, but right now the only, I think, current known site for it is in Clinton County in the Rose Lake area wildlife areas, preserve or whatever it's called, north of Lansing and East Lansing, in that area. It might still be in some of these other counties, but people have not been actively looking for it quite as much. It would be really good to, you know, once this COVID adventure is over, put a team of lepidopterists out in Michigan and really give a good search for this thing again at all of its historic sites to see if it's still there. It feeds on a plant called swamp thistle, and it's really in the swamp. The one colony I've seen, just getting to where it lived was quite the hassle. But once you got there, when we were there on a good day, we saw several adults. But a very rare little butterfly. And it's the only Michigan butterfly with a caterpillar that is hairy. All the other hairy caterpillars you'll see in Michigan grow up to be moths. This is the one hairy butterfly caterpillar. I don't have a picture of it. MitchellSeder, as I mentioned earlier, is when somebody questioned about rare butterflies. This one has been on the federal endangered list for some time, and Michigan threatened and endangered list. Michigan has the strongest populations of any state in the United States. There's a few areas in Ohio where it still exists. I think the other ones were in the Carolinas, and I don't know if they're still there. Feeds on various wild sedges as a caterpillar, but it will never be found outside of a really specific habitat. The tamarack poison sumac fen is a very special place. It's a wetland dominated by tamaracks and black spruce, and the understory is primarily sumacs, and many of them are poison sumac, and the rest of the stuff has got thorns as well. I've had one grand adventure looking for this species that I got this photograph. It was one of the most rugged afternoons I've ever encountered, trying to get through a habitat to find an opening where this butterfly was probably going to be. Somebody told me exactly where to go, and they were right, but whew, it was a battle getting there. I saw a dozen of them that day. In their very best habitats, you can still do all right. But this is one that's under protection. This one stopped the development or construction of an entire highway in Berrien County. If you ever drive through there and you're on US 31 coming north out of Indiana, and you wonder why it suddenly ends at a bridge overpass, it's because MitchellSeder colony was found just to the north of that overpass, and they stopped building the highway there. This is the Earlyhairstreak. This is my little favorite creature, my challenge butterfly. It is the least frequently seen species in Michigan, at least in the lower peninsula. There's some stuff in the UP that's pretty hard to find too. But this butterfly is always just, I think, pure luck to be encountered. It's how it kind of goes. I've known people that have been in this lepidoptery game their entire lives, 60, 70 years. and have never run into one of these things. And I've seen 4 of them and managed to photograph 2 of them. And I think I can't owe it to skill or knowledge. Let's put it that way. The second 2, or the third and fourth that I saw, were on a golf course while I was playing the course. I had a camera with me, remarkably, but it's not like I knew what I was doing and I was out there hunting for this thing. The caterpillars feed on developing nuts, the little floral tissues and developing nuts of beech, and they're also said to be on beaked hazelnut. What we think about this butterfly, based on all the places that it's been seen in the United States, and there's some populations through the Appalachians and up into Maine, is that it's probably not that uncommon in terms of, let's put it this way, not that scarce in terms of numbers, but its behavior keeps it from coming into where we would see it. The adults rarely ever come down out of the tops of high mature beech trees. They just don't leave the food plant area for anything. And beech trees being pretty tall, it's awful hard to know if you got early hair streaks way up in the air. The only times I've ever found them, I have been in extremely hilly country where I was at the same level as the tops of beech trees that were in much lower elevations, or at times immediately following very sudden storms and windy conditions where they probably chose to leave the canopy and come down to the ground. So it's a lot of combinations that have to be in place, I guess. And I have not seen one of these since 2007, I believe it is. And I go looking for it every year at several spots where it's been known and where I've seen it before. It's a very special little beast. If you ever see one, count yourself on the lucky pile. There are lots of other little butterflies with iridescent blue above that you might confuse it with, but so you got to get a look at the underside to see the off limey green and salmon to pink orange spots, which none of the other ones like it will have. I've got a few spots, new spots that I'm going to look for it this year. This is always on my target list, and I would just love to see a few more of this butterfly. There are folks in the Appalachians who say that, again, they're usually in very hilly sites where they're, sides of mountains and stuff, where you can sometimes find them regularly. But in Michigan, this has got to be the toughest one that isn't considered a threatened or endangered anyway. It's, even though you don't see it, that's really the opinion of professionals on this thing, that they are out there. We don't have to worry about this thing being threatened or endangered in terms of its survival. But that can change. Things can change very quickly, because one of our major tree problems right now is beech bark disease, which primarily kills mature large beeches, which are the ones that make the nuts, which are the ones that support this butterfly. Young beech trees don't do this thing any good. So we are losing a lot of beeches in the state right now, and that could severely impact the future success of early hair streaks. This is the book that you all need to have if you want to be into the Michigan butterfly scene. It came out in 1999. It's a little incomplete. There's a couple of new species since then that have been recorded, but this is still a wonderful field guide to Michigan butterflies, written by Mo Nielsen, who has passed away now. Mo is a very good friend of mine, and before he passed away, we came to the agreement that I could have all of the data and information that went into this book. I don't think it'll ever come out again in book form, but it is one of my life's goals now to produce this as a series of web pages, so we can update it, add those little green maps, and change the map every year as new records come in instead of having to wait a long time. So MSU Extension still has a bucket of these to get rid of. So you can usually find them if you try, and some bookstores even carry them. It's a wonderful reference for Michigan. There are a few others. These are places to go. Michigan Lepidoptera, which is a Facebook group. Butterflies or moths, identification help. You just post stuff, and the folks like me will look at it and give you our opinions when we can. There's a whole large United States version of that, Butterflies and Moths of North America. Same thing, you send in shots and people help identify it. I'm one of the people that work on Michigan submissions. There's a North American Butterfly Association, which is a little bit more active in the, let's say, policy side and support and interaction with public and private interests. They do giant butterfly counts every year. They don't count the whole number of butterflies. Like I mentioned earlier, we don't know how many of a particular species there is, but they do like a count on one day out of the year. What do they see in a particular area, which is a fun way to do it. And a really good website, actually a Facebook site, Caterpillar Identification of North America. Caterpillars are extremely hard to identify down to species and to recognize the different ones. So you'll always need help with that. I still have difficulty in telling apart many, especially the brushfoot butterfly caterpillars. Okay, yes, my email is on the bottom of this page. Good. I still have that MSU email. They tell me it's going to be active no matter how long I've been retired. So if you need to contact me about anything related to butterflies, moths, entomology, whatever, I'm open. I don't get to them as quick as I used to when I was working on the job every day, but entomologists I don't think ever really retire. And I know MSU extension people never really stop doing it. So open for questions and comments and whatever else we have time for.
All right, we have run out of time, but we can go over and finish these questions because the next talk doesn't start till 7 p.m. So we'll run through some of these.
Okay.
A couple from Jamie. He wants to know how many times a year might a Michigan butterfly lay eggs and how many eggs do they lay?
Okay. It will depend on the species. Quite a few of our butterflies have a single generation a year, and the adults will probably only fly during a 2 to 3 week period, which shifts a little bit depending on the weather and the temperature ranges. Most of them lay maybe in the range of 100 eggs or so at the very tops, and others quite a few less. We have a few species that can turn over 3 generations, maybe even 4, like Cabbage Butterfly might be able to do that in a warm year. But most of them are 1 or 2 at the most. And it may vary. There's some that can do 2 generations in the south and might only get 1 in northern Michigan. I think there's actually 2 oddball species that take 2 years to mature and they only show up as adults every other year. And they're very organized.
Another question is, can butterflies withstand 100-degree heat?
Most of them would not be able to stand it for long. You get up in the high 90s, middle 90s, and most insects start to have some trouble. When butterflies are very hot, they will either go to the shade or they will sit with their wings closed so that they cast the minimum amount of shadow. So the sun's aligned with the long way of the butterfly. And that keeps them from absorbing too much solar radiation. If they want to heat up a lot, they'll face their wings to take full sun. And if they really want to warm up, they'll open their wings in full sun and help warm their bodies.
Awesome. Are some butterflies poisonous?
Not really. The monarch butterfly and a few others are considered to be very distasteful to predators. Like birds, for instance, will get sick to their stomachs, but it doesn't kill them. And of course, there's very few bits of information about whether or not it would hurt people. It's usually wildlife, or sometimes dogs eat things and cats, but nothing that should kill anything.
Are there any conservation groups trying to repopulate a species with low numbers in Michigan?
Yeah, primarily working with the monarch, trying to overall improve its status through habitat manipulation, particular species planting, especially of course milkweeds, but also the nectar plants for them. That's on a very broad scale. And then there are individual groups and organizations working with things like a Karner Blue and within its range to keep its habitat in good shape.
Okay. And are genetic studies being done on any of the butterflies to determine species?
Yes, there are a few where they've been working on that. In fact, it was only middle 1990s when we figured out that the Eastern Tiger Swallowtail and Canadian Tiger Swallowtail were different creatures. And that was based somewhat on genetics and somewhat on very, very careful observations in the wild. There's been more of that in the moth world, where there are so many different pests, and they want to know more about their genetic makeup and what their relationships are to other moths.
How do butterflies feed before flowers bloom?
Well,
follow-up would be, how do they overwinter?
Yeah, right. The adults are typically out at times of the year when there is something blooming. It doesn't necessarily have to be a particular plant. Many of them will take nectar from dozens of different things. So that's a matter of just finding flowers. The more key thing is they need to be out and about laying eggs on their food plants for their caterpillars when those plants are in the right stages. If you get there too soon and there's not enough foliage, the caterpillars might starve if they hatch. If you lay the eggs too late in the year, the seasons will change and the caterpillars may not be able to get enough food before the leaves start decaying or falling off. They generally can find their way to get some nectar. If there's enough, diversity in the habitat, there's usually blooming plants for them. You'll see that some of the very earliest nectar sources are things you don't expect necessarily, like pussy willow, which starts extremely early, and some of the other willows have nectar that is good for those very early season beasts. And then the other part of that question was overwintering, or?
Yes, overwintering.
Okay. Yeah, each particular butterfly has a stage that it's built to be overwintered in. Quite a few of them overwinter as eggs, which are a very durable, stable condition. Some as adults, like we mentioned the painted lady, but there's probably a dozen others that overwinter as adults. And the caterpillar stage, which is soft and gooey and squishy, you'd think would be the hardest way to go through winter. There are several, actually quite a few butterflies in Michigan that overwinter as partially grown caterpillars. In all of those cases, they typically would be under leaf litter, under bark, low to the ground, taking advantage of the insulating effect of snow cover. But they also change their body chemistry tremendously. They generate high levels of essentially an antifreeze in their blood, so that they can go below 32 degrees, quite a ways below, and not have any ice crystals form in their cells. That's what really kills things. If you can get very, very cold if you don't let ice crystals form.
Awesome. Well, I think we've gone through all of our questions. I will mention that the Science Festival is doing a bio blitz. So if you're out looking for butterflies, go to the Science Festival's Citizen Science webpage and document your findings in the iNaturalist app, so we can help Dr. Elsner figure out what butterflies are here and at what time they're here. So that can really help us out. There is another talk scheduled at 7 p.m. called The World's Weirdest Bees. To find that, you can go to sciencefestival.msu.edu, click the schedule, and then click the event, and the link will take you right to the webinar, or it will be broadcast live on Facebook Live. And with that, thank you, Dr. Elsner. This has been a terrific talk. We really appreciate it.
I'm glad to be the kickoff for the festival.
Thank you. Everyone have a good night, and we have 29 more days.
Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you.